As the greenhouse effect takes hold, environmental experts have warned that animals and crops unable to cope with the rapid temperature rise and climatic changes will die out. The first evidence of such changes is now appearing in Antarctica. Temperatures there are rising faster than at any time in the past 10,000 years, melting the ice and undermining the food chain. Penguins are the first species to suffer. Our science correspondent Andrew Veach sailed aboard a Greenpeace ship to the Antarctic Peninsula. As he reports, the cycle of life in the not-so-frozen continent is now under threat.
Late summer in the crackling ice water of the Antarctic Peninsula. The leopard seals are waiting for their annual feast. Seals move fast underwater, but penguins are faster, so chasing them is a waste of energy. They wait in the channels the birds must use to reach their rookery and their ravenous young. On Torgerson Island, this year's chicks are fast losing their juvenile fluff. Within weeks, their parents will leave to winter far out on the pack ice. The young must follow or starve. So now they're fattening on regurgitated krill, the tiny shrimp-like creatures which fuel life in Antarctica. By the time they take their first swim, they'll be bite-sized for the next link in the food chain. For the leopard seals, the time of feasting is at hand. In this climate, timing is everything. The cycle of life must match the cycle of the ice, and the cycle is changing.
As little as 2 decades ago, ecologists were predicting that the Arctic and the Antarctic should really be the places where we look for climate change signatures. And that is, in fact, what we've seen. This is actually the colony I wanted to bring you to.
This stretch of shoreline held a thriving rookery last year, but this year, when the penguins returned to their nests, it was snowbound. Only 3 chicks have survived. The temperature on the Antarctic Peninsula has risen by 2.5 degrees centigrade over the past 50 years. The warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, so precipitation is greater. At these latitudes, that means, in general, more snow and more cloud to prevent it melting. The reproductive cycle of the birds is out of step with the weather.
There is a strong seasonal cycle in the ice, and the ice dictates much of the biology we see. So I think it's probably true that if climate change starts to bite in the sea, the most direct effect will not be through a temperature change in the water, but through the effect of that climate change on the pattern of ice distribution and the behavior of ice.
The ice is stained yellow by phytoplankton, algae feeding on sunlight. This is the base of the Antarctic food chain. The baby krill depend on it, and without krill, the web of life in Antarctica begins to fall apart.
If the ice has extended over the krill spawning ground, these larvae have their wintering grounds right above them. They have plenty of food. They'll survive the winter. They'll live to the next summer and be a large group. If this ice does not extend over their spawning grounds, the larval krill die. As a result, there's not as much food for the penguins. So that's where we see the decline in the penguins.
Records of the rookeries near Palmer Station go back 25 years. The numbers of Adelie penguins have fallen by 19%. This year alone, after another warm winter, the numbers fell from 11,500 breeding pairs to less than 8,000. The numbers of chinstrap penguins, however, are increasing. While the Adelies need pack ice, chinstraps prefer open water, so in one way they benefit from warmer winters.
The worst possible case scenario obviously would be that the system changes quite drastically in terms of the distribution of species and that sort of thing. But the way climate change seems to work, at least what we're seeing, is that it's not so much that the system is collapsing in some way, it's just that different species are replacing other species. Some of us have set new world records on the 100-yard dash here at Palmer, little-known records. Sprinting when these things get upset.
A fur seal used to be a rare sight on these islands. This summer, says Bill Fraser, there are 2,000 of them. And the numbers of elephant seals have tripled. Like chinstrap penguins, they prefer open water and the edges of ice floes. Seals like the same beaches as penguins, and that's breaking up the rookeries. If an elephant seal chooses to flop on a penguin's patch of pebbles, it's the penguin that moves. And these females who've come ashore to molt are comparatively small. A mature male weighs 4,000 kilos. The colonies become fragmented, less able to defend themselves against marauding skuas. The skuas will take the chicks as well as the eggs. It seems that colonies of anything less than 40 breeding pairs are easy prey.
The environment here is extremely sensitive. What seems to be a tiny increase in temperature is having a massive impact on the ice and the wildlife that depends on it. What happens if the temperature continues to rise? Well, the penguins will either move out or die out.
Simon Brockington and Martin White are diving at the British Rothera base on Adelaide Island. The seas are rich in life.
Every group is represented there, with the exception of the decapods, which is the crabs and the lobsters. But everything else is there in abundance, and this is really common. And they can get a lot bigger than this.
Instead of crabs and lobsters, the Antarctic has an aquatic version of the British woodlouse.
One of the other things about working on polar regions is the water's cold. So here we've got the two of them. The male is larger than the female. The female is beneath, the male on top. And you'll see that he has a pair of claws at the front which enable him to grip the female really quite hard. And they will stay like this for weeks on end. One of the reasons that many of the animals that do get large in the Antarctic is because they do everything slowly. Their metabolism ticks over slowly, they grow slowly, they reproduce infrequently, and they live to a ripe old age. As I say, this one is probably 30 or 40 years old at least.
The fish have evolved antifreeze to keep their blood flowing. Adaptation to the cold makes them vulnerable to warming.
Here, the fluctuations between the seasons are quite small, only maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. And many of these animals appear to suffer thermal stress, high temperature stress, at all of about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, water which for us would be freezing cold. So that suggests that if there is a gradual warming of the water here, these animals might have a problem.
Across the bay on Leone Island, the plants are the most visible sign of the changes. Mossy banks are spreading over the rock. The plants are soaking up the sun. Pearlwort is flowering, so is the Antarctic grass.
It has spread quite fast over the last 5 or 6 years. The plants over here have been adapted for years, centuries, thousands of years to a very stable climate. And now, since the last decades, this climate is changing, and the response to it by the plants is very rapid.
Whales cannot respond rapidly. In the Bismarck Strait, a pair of humpbacks feast on krill. Like the seals and penguins, they're dependent on a food source that is dependent on ice. Now this brittle ecosystem is facing the fastest rise in temperature for perhaps 10,000 years. Andrew Veach, Channel 4 News, in Paradise Bay, Antarctica.
A look at the Antarctic Treaty for the Practice of Science for the Benefit of the Planet. But 26 countries now operate bases on the continent. The northwestern tip of Antarctica lies just 1,000 kilometers from South America, and amongst those jostling for position with military-run bases are Argentina and Chile. Britain, with the Falkland Islands close by, also has an eye on the territory. Our science correspondent Andrew Veach sailed to Antarctica with Greenpeace, and in the last of his special reports visits the South Shetland Islands and examines whether the attraction of the peninsula may not be science, but oil.
Polar warriors from the interior, those for whom -30 is a spring day, call these islands the banana belt. True, the temperatures can reach +5 on a summer's morning, but it's also a reference to what many veterans see as South American colonization of this, the least inhospitable corner of Antarctica. Chile's foothold on the peninsula, the Marsh Frey base on King George Island. They've built a small town here, the Town of the Stars. 2 babies have been born here. It was a planned operation after Argentina, with a base nearby, claimed the first Antarctic birth. Families live here for most of the year. There's a school and a hospital.
You are so close to nature, and that's a very special occasion in your life, to be so close to nature. You can feel, even I would say that you can feel God everywhere you go. It's so clean, so pure.
Officially, the base exists only to provide weather reports and to support the Chilean Antarctic Institute, INACH, and visiting scientists. Under the Antarctic Treaty, its activities are confined to science. By international treaty, this entire continent is a demilitarized zone. Yet the Chilean base here is run by the military. This airport takes military planes. And in the bay, there are Chilean gunboats. Chile has laid claim to the whole Antarctic peninsula. So have Argentina and Britain. All have agreed to freeze their claims under the Antarctic Treaty. So how could the base commander justify such a show of force?
No tienen armamento. No sé si le vieron armamento, pero no tienen. Y le aclaro, son 2 buques de la Armada de Chile. Uno de esos buques presta servicios a INACH. Está completo de científicos. Y el otro buque presta apoyo logístico a esta y otras bases del sector.
The commander later explained that the boats carried no ammunition for their cannon. Argentina and the United States, among others, still rely on the military for their transport. In the rush to stake an interest, if not a claim, Brazil and Uruguay, as well as China and South Korea, have set up bases in the banana belt.
The existence of these gunboats is much more related to their territorial claim, and in this area there are 3 overlapping territorial claims from Argentina, Chile and the UK, so it's perhaps more acute here than anywhere else. But Chile very much sees this as an extension of their country, and I've heard senior diplomats talk about wanting to see a whole string of Chilean villages all the way down the coast. The gunboats are here as part of their sort of exercise of port sovereignty and generally looking after the area.
This was a Soviet enclave. Bellingshausen base was built 30 years ago in the middle of what was then a nature reserve. Chile joined them later. Now Russia's Antarctic aspirations are rusting. So much equipment is broken that their atmospheric scientist is passing his time mending a larder.
Our Russian Antarctic expedition now have a very difficult time, and I think that money which we receive from our government is not enough for you see our condition now. And sometimes we haven't enough money for people, not only for base.
Well, enough money for paying people?
Yes, not enough. Maybe sometimes it's enough, but it's not in time.
Armoured personnel carriers designed for the Siberian permafrost have pounded the earth into a swamp. Despite attempts to clear the rubbish, much of it is piled on the beach. Russia, along with Japan and the United States, has yet to ratify an agreement which would make it mandatory to clean up the bases in Antarctica. Britain has pulled out of King George Island. The graves of the men, the boys, who died maintaining Britain's right to this rock in a dispute with Argentina that started 50 years ago, are all that is left of the base in Admiralty Bay. South of the Banana Belt, the flag still flies. Port Lockroy was the first permanent British base in Antarctica, built by the Navy in 1944 at an old whaling anchorage on Winky Island. The colony of Gentoo penguins was a convenient larder. Officers preferred them fried in port wine. Abandoned 35 years ago, Bransfield House has been restored by the British Antarctic Survey. Now it's a regular port of call for the small fleet of ships ferrying wealthy tourists on summer trips to the peninsula.
We've had over 2,000 visitors, and if it's not manned, then it will, you know, the place will start to deteriorate again. And if you've had 100 visitors coming through, particularly weather like this, where there's penguin muck everywhere, obviously the tour operators aren't going to have time to go and sweep through after them. So having a caretaker, a couple here, just to keep an eye on things. It is part of history. It's very much part of Britain's history, and you know, we're quite proud of what we've got here now. It's quite a showpiece now.
Faraday, one of the more hospitable watering holes in Antarctica, was taken over by the Ukraine last year. The British Antarctic Survey rationalised its operations, and it was cheaper to give the huts away than to dismantle them. The Ukraine was chosen because its scientists were well qualified to continue the work. They were preeminent in the old Soviet Antarctic program. Renamed Vernadsky, the Ukrainians are preserving Faraday's uniquely British institutions. In this attic, Joe Farman and his colleagues discovered the ozone hole. Day in, day out, year upon year, Farman climbed up here to measure the ozone layer with his aging Dobson spectrophotometer. He called it Daphne. His findings alerted the world to an environmental disaster. The daily measurements are now taken by a veteran of the Soviet Antarctic program. The results are transmitted direct to Cambridge.
I feel very good feeling when I work with the same machine that Joe Farman working so many years ago. It's very important because we need to repeat all measurements the same way, because we need to continue the raw data of ozone measurements on this place the same way like before.
The British presence has been consolidated here at Rothera and across the Weddell Sea at Halley. Scientists fly in from Port Stanley. Civilians have taken over from the Navy, but this is still regarded as British Antarctic territory. While territorial aspirations have been frozen, they have not been forgotten. The oil fields around the Falkland Islands are already being parcelled out. If there is oil on the Antarctic Peninsula, this will be the next target. Britain has ensured that if the political barriers to exploitation are removed, if the Antarctic Treaty fails, it would be in a strong position to stake a claim, which, for all the fine words pledging the last relatively unpolluted spot on Earth to science, is why everybody else is here too. Andrew Veach, Channel 4 News, King George Island, Antarctica.
I look again at tonight's headlines.
The bottom of the world. I was so fortunate in being able to go to one of the most truly beautiful places on Earth.